Hey, can you hear me?
No.
Oh, fuck you. All right, mate. All right. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, Joe and I, we just came up with this topic, or found this topic about 10 minutes ago, and we just decided to do it. So we've had very little time to prepare for it. So I'll be debating the pro side of this motion, that assuming the technology existed to transfer human pregnancies from an incubator, to an incubator, we would ban all natural pregnancy. So the first thing I want to talk about is just to be clear what this technology is most likely to look like. Assuming that this would be banned, it would not cost you any money to have your pregnancy taken from the womb of the woman into the incubator. It would just be something that occurs when you realize you're pregnant. You would go to the doctor or whatever institution is set up. They would transfer it to an incubator. 9 months later, you would still get the child. You would still have all of the normal rights that you normally have with parenting. Does that sound reasonable definition of the technology to you?
Sounds very reasonable.
Excellent. So I think this is a technology and a law that would fix a gaping problem. And that problem is that pregnancy sucks. A couple of reasons why it sucks. One, it's exceptionally painful. Two, it's irreversible. The reason why it's irreversible is after the first trimester, it's really hard to get an abortion. Or if you do try and abort the baby yourself, you face significant harm just to your own personal body. So it's a choice you make in the beginning, but after 3 months, after it's physically attached to you, there's very little you can do. So it's an irrevocable choice. And thirdly, that there is going to be damaging effects to your body even post the pregnancy. So that is to say, often there is tearing of the vagina and labia, but your breasts are extended and they never return to their full, tautness that they previously had before, and just a host of other physical things that happen to you that can't be reversed. Secondly, it really hurts a woman in particular for their ability to make money in the workforce. That is to say, they often have to take time off. That is not only to care for the child, but also while they're physically getting pregnant. For some professions, that makes it harder to work. And importantly, you also get removed from your job earlier than perhaps you should be removed because of the stigma or the assessment that you're going to be being removed anyway, which means that businesses often act preemptively. Thirdly, economically, it's really expensive to go through just a natural pregnancy, given that all of the medicines and stuff that you have to take. It's obviously going to be significantly cheaper if it goes through an incubator. Now, before I finish, the reason why a woman cannot consent to this, so reason why a lot can't argue, well, we have this technology, why don't you just have a choice? I'm going to give you reasons why a woman can't consent to this harm and why the government must force them to give up natural pregnancy. Firstly, women right now actually have very little choice when it comes to pregnancy. That is to say, if they want to have a child, they still elect to do it, but they do so because they're socialized into saying that they have to be having children, that the value of a woman comes from how fertile they are. These norms are still going to persist post the fact on the introduction of this technology, which means they're still likely going to choose this out of spite for that, or likely be coerced by the men around them. And secondly, this is a policy that actually rights a wrong that would normally occur. That is to say, only women can get physically pregnant. Men cannot get physically pregnant. So in some way, this actually evens out the playing field and makes it physically fairer on that moral ground. So I'll pass over to you.
All right. Like he said, we kind of jumped into this last moment. So I'd like to thank Liam the Gator for this. By the way, if nobody knows, Liam is a gator.
All right, mate. All right.
And he should be referred to as that from henceforth. So before I go into my plan, I'm actually going to start on yours. So problem one, painful, irreversible, damage to body. Yes, it is painful, but it's actually a natural progression of pain. It's not like it's not like you just wake up one day and it's just massive pain, right? So the female body is actually built to take that pain in certain parameters, right? Like the sacroiliac joint is actually meant to bend in a certain way to allow for pregnancy to open up the hips. Secondly, damage to body hurts women in the workforce, which keeps them back. But I'm not exactly sure what workforce, as we move away from an industrial age and we move towards a technological age, I'm not exactly sure the physical demands of the workforce would actually, stop the female from working even if she was pregnant. So I'm not exactly sure, based on the technology of this action, would somehow that technology not lay over into the workforce? Expensive for women to continue, their pregnancy. Again, I don't think that this is an actual argument, because if we're at the point that we're able to remove a child from the female and place it into an incubator and grow it for 9 months, and I'm sure that the technology and the medicine that is applied to women while pregnant would still be, just as cheap. I don't think you get to limit the cost on my end and then add it, or limit the cost on your end and then add it to my end. And then the next one, you say they cannot consent. So they have very little choice, and that they're socialized, even if they do get pregnant, to continue. I don't think that you're making a solid social constructionist argument, specifically because I think there's a biological portion here that you're missing out. I think women are far more biologically motivated to have children than they are to be socially motivated to have children. And next, that females are going to be coerced by men to have the child with the woman more so than they will to have the child in an incubator. I actually don't believe that's true. I actually think men would be more likely to push women to have the incubator babies than they would to hold it to themselves. So I don't think that really counts, and that it rights a moral wrong that only women can get pregnant but men cannot. I don't think the biology of the world is a moral wrong. I think we were all given a fair handshake when we are born, and I think you do with what you have. So I don't think it's a moral quandary that somehow or another females get pregnant and men don't, because men have other issues that we have to deal with that women don't. So I think that there's no reason to balance it, since it's already balanced between them already biologically. Now we'll get to my points. So I don't actually even have to worry about the idea that some women should be able to consent. I don't actually need that. What I will say is that the strongest point here of this debate that I want everybody to listen to is that when a woman is pregnant, it is the strongest bond of love you could possibly have. And that bond not only carries while the woman is pregnant, it carries past the time the woman has been pregnant, right? So you can hand a woman a child without her ever being pregnant. She will love it. But that love does not, in my opinion, and I think most women would agree, come close to holding a child in your body for 9 months and then to watch the child come out of you in one of the most beautiful experiences ever, to hold in your arms. And I don't think that banning natural pregnancy would do well for the female or the child, because that moment of love is far greater than any consequentialist argument that you can make. Secondly, I do think that there is a consequentialist argument to be made. This consequentialist argument is that women and men are more apt to love a child that is born from the womb than they are from adoption and other things. And I know that's a very controversial point, but again, we are animals, right? So women are more likely to kill children. One of those ideas is that, not much like lions, right? So if a male lion comes into a pride and he wants to take over, the first thing he does is, after he defeats the other males, is to murder all the cubs. That way it puts the females back in the heat. Therefore, he can propagate his line more so than that other lion's line. And I do think that since we are biological primal creatures at our core, I do think that we will fall into this. Lastly, about abortion, I don't think that this fixes the problem for abortion, because women get abortions because they don't want the child. I don't think taking the child out and incubating it somehow makes it an irrelevant point. It doesn't fix abortion. If the woman doesn't want the child, she doesn't want the child at all, whether it's born in an incubator or not. She doesn't want it. So I don't think that really helps the argument.
Okay then. Okay, so I'll start with all the responses that Joe gave to my case, and then I'll give some responses to his case. So the first response he has to my case is to say, well, it's a natural progression of pain, and that makes it okay. 2 responses. Firstly, death is also a natural progression of pain. That doesn't mean it's something that the government should allow and actively tries to stop. Secondly, we know people that recognize that they have a revealed preference to avoid pain. So even though female bodies are apt at dealing with the pain of pregnancy and giving birth, almost all women still opt for anesthetics while giving birth. That gives a revealed preference to note that they would prefer not endure that pain. Secondly, it's also a naturalistic fallacy to identify just because something is natural, meaning it's good or bad. The thing I'm pointing out here is that it's about the arguments around that thing, not the identification that it is natural. The next thing that he says, is say, well, I don't understand any professions that this would occur to. A couple of professions: just working in an office, sitting up all day under a desk in an unnatural position. And obviously I'm talking unnatural here is that it's uncomfortable and is not something that the human body is designed for. Therefore, it would be taxing on that woman. Or even wearing things like high heels is often a thing that a lot of pregnant women complain about. Additionally, I didn't just say some professions will be removed from, but there's also a perception that women can't do it, so they get removed earlier, even if they didn't even need to be removed at all. So that is something that still occurs regardless of the biological fact. The next claim that he makes in response to my case is to say, well, it's an expensive thing, and you can't assume that there wouldn't be these other technologies anyway. Fine, I agree. I'll give you all the other technologies, but the thing I'm pointing out here is that there's physical harm that comes to the woman, which requires medication when you're physically pregnant. Those things do not come about when you have it in an incubator. So even if the medicine is cheap, it still exists and it's still expense you have to go through. The next thing he says is with regard to consent. He says it's actually more biologically motivated. Firstly, there is some social pressure and some biological pressure. I agree, but biological motivation is still not consensual because you don't consent to your biology in the same way you don't consent to being a man or a woman. In that circumstance, it is still a circumstance in which consent does not exist, and therefore the government should try and move away from it. The next claim he makes is to say, well, some men would not force women. I think some men very likely would. For example, those in conservative or religious communities where the woman's value is derived by them having kids, or the exact sentiment that Locke started his speech with, it's the most sacred form of love. That is something that is the rhetoric that is likely to be used by those communities and coerce women into it. So that is all the reasons to believe that the responses to his case to my case were insufficient. What are the arguments he made? The first argument he makes is to say this is the strongest form of love and therefore we should not remove it. Firstly, that you can probably still get that bond in other ways. Secondly, men obviously don't get that bond, or infertile women don't get that bond. That is an unfair thing that we should try and remove. Thirdly, if the problem is that parents, this is his controversial argument, that parents are better equipped at helping children after they've gone through the physical process of having the child through their bodies, we can fix that in a number of really easy ways. And the best way to identify that is, as he concedes, humans are animals and our brains work by different hormone levels in our brains, and those hormones change different to subject to different bodily functions. So, for example, you can measure the hormones in a woman's brain post-pregnancy and pre-pregnancy and post-labor and see the changes that have occurred there. We could naturally do those. We could simulate those things by just giving them those hormones as pills to take, in the same way we do with other hormonal imbalances like postnatal depression. Importantly, postnatal depression doesn't happen on my side as well, because that's also an extra benefit. Additionally, then, the claim that it is the strongest form of love is not one that is beneficial, and the reason for that is that, as I identified before, you could get it elsewhere, but it doesn't outweigh just all of the women that die during pregnancy, all of the women that are coerced during pregnancy. We could stop all of that very, very easily and increase the agency of all of those women, meaning that they don't have to give up their jobs. The final claim he makes is to say, well, this doesn't help for abortion advocacy. I actually think it does. And the reason for that is that he says, when someone gets an abortion, they don't want the kid. That's not strictly true. A lot of the time, if you don't want the kid, you can just make a ward of the state. This actually fixes the problem of the abortion debate in places like America and Australia. And the reason for that is that the pro-abortion guys say, or the pro-choice guys say, it's the women's body, it's the women's choice, she deserves her body back. And the pro-life guys say, well, you can't kill another thing. This fixes that problem because the woman gets her body back and the child still gets to live. If the woman does not want that child, they can just put it up for adoption like they do under the status quo. But now we don't need abortion to do that thing. I think that's strictly better. The final in substantive argument I'm going to make in this section before I pass over is to identify that this helps for the advocacy of women in these circumstances. There's there's a problem right now in which women are seen as lesser because of their likelihood to have kids, and that means that they end up losing their jobs, or they get removed from their jobs and have career progression stunted. This makes it unlikely for that to occur. It makes it easier to advocate for change in policies in both on a company level and on a governmental level, because now they don't have this massive biological drawback that men also don't have. This makes them more equal in some regard. That means it's likely to be better for them in the future. I'll pass over.
Okay, thank you for those points. So let's talk about this. You say that the bond isn't unfair between the mother and the mother to the child, and men don't get to feel it, and women who don't get to have children, they don't get to have that, and that's unfair, so it ought to be fixed. Under no circumstances does something that is unfair have to be fixed, specifically with respect to the equilibrium of life. Life is about a steady state equilibrium. We can both agree to that. Throwing things off of equilibrium to make one side feel better does not mean that there's not going to be some other action. We can look at chaos theory, the attractors. Whatever may happen, whatever good that you can have from that does not necessarily mean that it will stay good, because there's plenty of unintended consequences that may happen to this, which is my impact for that. My impact for that is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, right? Where we will start to have a Fordist totalitarian sexuality, and that incentivizes women to go be more freer towards sex, because they have to have, since they have no disincentivizations towards that, which having a child and pregnancy based on your problem set that you gave of painful, irreversible, and damage to body, those disincentivize women to have free sex. So I think once you come to the point where they can just go, oh, well, I'm pregnant, just stick it in a tube, you're just incentivizing some ridiculous things to happen. Yes.
There's this thing called the contraceptive pill. It just basically means it's about as effective as a condom, 99% effective. You just take it every day, and it just means a woman basically can't get pregnant. These are things that exist in the United States, but because of your healthcare system, are very expensive. But in Australia, they're subsidized and they're very cheap. So basically everyone gets them in Australia. And we don't see that type of behavior you just described. So why is it you think that this technology would bring about that behavior?
Well, one, because it does. It has in the United States specifically. We can see higher rates of divorce. We see higher rates of infidelity and those things. So it does happen. And as an aside, contraceptives and the hormone pills in the United States is not very expensive. It's like $10 a month. If that's expensive, then just stop having sex and commit to abstinence. Anyway. But I do think that it incentivizes, because we can look at the statistical play since the advent of abortion, that it has created a moral hazard for women by incentivizing freer sex. Almost in relation to, we've seen the sexual revolution directly with the abortion revolution, right? Anyway, so you say that you can fix the love in other ways, right? So how parents are apt, you're going to give them the natural hormone treatment that will allow them to have the same. But then you're just continuously adding things to make it easier for this, whereas you could just have the child naturally. Again, there's nothing wrong with having the child naturally. Now, to the pro-life, pro-choice debate about that this would make the debate moot. If the female doesn't want the child and moves it off to that, and it becomes a ward of the state, consequentially, wards of the state do very bad, right? Foster children and these things, they're at like 70% rate of getting raped or molested as children if they don't have someone to pick them up and take care of them. And if we're going to have what I had stated, we're going to have an influx of kids, which means they're all going to be chunking through this foster care system that is very detrimental to children and has done nothing but have negative impacts. All right. Women die and they're coerced into marriage, right? Women die. Men die for very stupid reasons too, and it's awful, and we ought to regret that. However, that doesn't mean that the consequenceless argument sticks to you. Anyway, and then the lesser than women, it's somehow, again, I already explained that. It's not that they're lesser and it's not that men are greater, it's that we're equal in different forms. And there's no reason to toss away the biological function of humanity to pander to a small percentage of people who may want something different. All right, so to build my case back up, it's absolutely true that the love that you feel for a child in your womb is the greatest feeling. You ask any mother who brought their child to term, even ones that felt postpartum depression. One of the fundamental things of postpartum depression is that they don't have that feeling of a child still in them. That is, one, a biological function, and two, it's an emotional function of humans, right? So if you can somehow give the hormonal treatment that changes women from being disagreeable to more agreeable upon having children, you still don't get to fill that void that woman would have for the love of her child. And with that, I'm passing to you.
All right. Okay. So the first thing I want to look at is the claim that just because there is unfairness, that doesn't mean it needs to be fixed. In an absolute logical sense, that is true. Fairness does not imply necessity to fix. However, the government exists to fix unfairness. That is why we have things like progressive tax systems. That's why we have things like social security nets. The reason and the reason for that is irrelevant. We're talking about the government doing something which is banning, and we're recognizing a revealed preference of the government to do those things. So the intuitive question to ask then is, do you on con support do not support things like government policies that give like money or services to those with disabilities, people who are born into unfairness, who weren't given that fair shake you spoke about in your first speech, and were doomed to a strictly worse life because they have less economic power?
Are you asking me directly right now? So I think it really depends, right? So a brief explanation would be to read John Locke's treatise on government and how the government should intervene in certain cases. However, I don't think that is analogous to this discussion, because you're talking about a minor inequality to someone who I take care of my aunt, or I did for some time. She was in a wheelchair and she's very special. She has the mind of a 5-year-old. And we do get some money. It's not much, but we do get some money to help. However, I don't think that inequality between me and her is anywhere near the inequality between me and my wife when she got pregnant.
Yeah, I'm not comparing you and your wife. I'm identifying something that's unfair. Like, if a couple wants to have kids, they almost certainly have to get pregnant. And the reason for that is that adoption is very expensive. And as you identified, a lot of kids who go through adoptive services end up being sexually abused or punished, which means that a lot of parents don't want them. They want babies because they want to bring that kid up. So that means you basically have to get pregnant. So this forces them into something they shouldn't have to be forced into. The next claim you make is to say, well, these disincentives, and this is the point where I interrupted you in your speech, about these disincentives to practice safe sex, which leads to worse social outcomes. I identified before that things like the contraceptive pill in Australia, which is very ubiquitous, does not have those problems and basically gives women free rein to do whatever they like, as they should be able to do so. Your response to this is to say, well, divorce rates have been increasing. I Googled the divorce rates for Australia. 10 years ago, it was 2.7 per 1,000, and a year ago, it was 2.2, and now it's 2.1 people per 1,000. The divorce rates have been decreasing in Australia. Now, obviously, that's not the only factor or the only metric by which you could assess it, but Australia is not the anarchy that was claimed in Brave New World that a lot like Locke spoke about in his speech. So I don't think that's a sufficient argument. The next claim he says is to say, well, this doesn't solve the abortion debate because these kids still become the ward of the state. A couple of responses. One, it's still very few of them. Like, of the abortions that are had, very, very, like, of all pregnancies, very few of them end in abortion. So we're not talking about a large influx. Secondly, that's presumably better than them dying. So, like, them being in a ward of the state is probably better than them just being killed because this technology was not in place. Thirdly, that argument is contingent upon showing that there would be an increase in abortive services required, which I just demonstrated was unlikely to be true because of the case study of Australia. And thirdly, if there is such an influx of these people in the best characterization of a lot like Locke's case, then you could just claim that this increased pressure is likely to increase government pressure to fix the ward system that we have right now for adoptive kids. So I think all of those things, if that harm comes to fruition, it writes itself very quickly. But I think it's unlikely that harm has come to fruition. The important thing I want to talk about here is that the major inequality between men and women derives from earning power. And the reason why that earning power doesn't exist is because women simply get to work less because they often have to do extra work, and that extra work is taking care of a kid or being pregnant. This simply fixes that problem, which means that the economic inequality between men and women and the economic power between men and women interrelationship is likely to be assuaged and is therefore likely to be beneficial. This means you don't get women being forced into abusive relationships, staying at home, or even non-abusive relationships. Just like they don't earn enough money, but they don't have enough money to leave the person they're with if they're unhappy. So just like they're just generically unhappy. These are things that just straight up fixes that problem because they're more likely to have a career. And importantly, that they get to choose to have that career. Like they can still be a stay-at-home mom if they want to, but this lets them still have a large, increased career prospects. And the important thing I think you're missing is that increases the likelihood of policy change, which means that women are less likely to be let go prematurely because employers know that they're likely to have kids.
All right. So start off with, I want everybody to understand, he said true, but however, government should be able to intervene because there is unfairness. Again, I disagree. There has to be some measuring of what is fair to unfair here. We can't just fix everything unfair or we'll be chopping everybody's legs off of anyone who's over 5'9", and everybody's going to be the same height. These are types of unfairnesses. This is one of those types of unfairnesses that the government does not get to intervene in because it's part of our natural biology. You cannot intervene to make everybody the same height. You cannot intervene to make everybody the same IQ. You cannot intervene to make everybody have the same temperament.
Do you think the government...
These are places...
Sorry, do you think the government should fund cancer research?
Consequentially, not particularly, no. But as an overall goal, I think it should fund towards, but not for.
So you're saying the government would prefer less people have cancer? So yes. The government would prefer less people in bad situations?
Yes, the government would prefer people to be taller. That way they'll make more money. But they can't intervene in that.
Yeah, but you can't intervene in the height of someone, but you can intervene in what happens to their body, you know?
Specifically with this, at this moment, yes, you can, but you have to ask, is it necessary? And again, that's where we get this weighing mechanism. And I don't think that it's necessary, specifically because this is a natural function of reality. I don't think anytime it's become a natural function that it should.
Cancer's natural. Death is natural.
Yeah, and I think the government shouldn't stop you from dying. I don't. How does the government stop you from dying?
Healthcare and not having other people hurt you and funding research. Like you know what I mean? Like this is a natural thing that harms a lot of people. The government should stop it.
Right, but I think we're getting off track here. So forces, the disincentives, right? So Australia, as one case study, somehow manages to be different. And I looked it up, and it does. However, we can look at the United States and say the exact opposite. The United States is a great way to look at it and see the exact opposite of what he said about divorce rates. The United States has become absolutely disparagingly bad in divorce, in sexuality, and it's driven a serious problem And again, it goes back to that child protective services and other things that have caused even more problems. Those negative impacts did happen because of contraceptives, because of abortion. Secondly, on abortion, and did you say that the large influx of children and somehow or another that would force us to make the government? However, that doesn't fix the problem that this large influx of children very well may come from very bad people who can't take care of their children. They are biologically disposed to be not as good humans. This is a sad reality, right? So Stephen Levitt of the University of Chicago took a longitudinal study of abortion, and he found that the number one cause of the decrease in crime rates in the United States was the fact that 50 million children were aborted over this time frame. If those 50 million children had not been aborted, there would have been a huge influx of crime because IQ, dispositions, and those things are typically genetic, even more so than they are of the nurture. Which is another point that I'm going to bring up. So you said the major inequality is that women work less, and that the simple fix for the purchasing power. Between men and women.
What's the name of that study? Oh, and who's it by?
Stephen Levitt.
Stephen Levitt.
You can look it up. Yeah.
Okay. Cheers. Go on. Yeah. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think that the major inequality between men and women is that women get pregnant and move out of the workforce. There's still inequality for women, even if they don't have children, even if they do move out of, even if they stay in the workforce while pregnant. The major inequality between men and women is the IQ distribution. Men's distribution for IQ on the bell curve is much wider. Therefore, we have more idiots and more geniuses, where women typically hover around the mean much, much more. Their standard deviation is also smaller. So you're much less likely to run into a female mathematician than you are a male mathematician. Granted, that's a biological issue. That's not a social issue that you can intervene in by allowing women to just not have to go through pregnancy. So I don't think that point, again, it's non-unique to this problem, because I don't think that it fixes it in the long run. And then, so back to build up my case, I do want to build up more on this love, right? So he's kind of given some soft answers to love, but let's get to what love is and the love that a woman feels for her child. I can tell you from anecdotal experience that feeling the child kick and watching the mother react to the child kick, it's akin to the greatest entertainment that you'll ever have, right? So we do find utility in entertainment. So if you had the greatest piece of entertainment, but this entertainment manages to hurt people at a very small rate, would we still ban it? No, because the utility that we gain from this experience is greater than what we will save from the consequentialist argument about banning natural pregnancies. Now, if he gave me the caveat that there was a point to consent, then we would have a bigger argument. But the moment you take away the idea that the female cannot consent to it, you lose the idea that these women don't get to feel a child kick in their stomach, and that this utility that they gain from this experience, from this entertainment, is greater than what they will gain by banning it.
All right, okay. The first thing I want to look at is that study you claim that more children being aborted leads to less crimes. I think you've got the logic a little bit backwards. The reason why that led to less crimes is not because those kids would have grown up to have low IQs or some genetic predisposition to be criminals. It was because that in those communities, it would end up the woman just being a single mother, and a single mother taking care for a kid, as I told you earlier, is significantly expensive, which means they can't afford things like a good education, and they're more likely to slip into illegal trades or just committing crimes in gangs. Now, those abortions gave greater agency to those women because they did not have this child after them, and it meant that they didn't have those medical expenses. Now, my policy fixes that, because they do not have to carry around this child for 9 months, and then they can make it a ward of the state. Your responses to my ward of the state were to say this influx of people doesn't fix the problem. As I identified before, I had 4 responses. One of them was that if there's an influx, it means that there's more pressure on the state to do things about it. For example, whenever there's a problem in society, people get grumpy and lobby the government, and the government changes. But I gave you lots of reasons to believe why there wouldn't be this influx, because of all the pregnancies that had, very few of them result in abortions. And even then, I think it makes it more economically viable for a woman to keep that child if they don't want to make it a ward of the state. Your next claim is to say, well, then women experience a very good amount of utility from that entertainment, and we shouldn't take that away. I want you to compare that to the massive harms of women dying in pregnancy, women having lower earning potential because of the societal perception that they will leave their job and have kids, and women being coerced into having kids because of that very same societal perception. Now, like, I get when you're having kids, it feels really good as your biological predisposed to do so. But as I said in like earlier in the debate, a biological predisposition is something that you don't consent to. For example, those who have biological predispositions to disabilities don't consent to those disabilities, and thus the government should intervene. In the same way, this is the government intervening, fixing a very, very good problem. And also the final claim I want to make about that woman's love is that, to be honest, it is a big thing, and people would be grumpy about it for perhaps a generation, but then they would forget that that's something that normally occurs, and it would just equally be replaced by seeing their kid in the incubator, or the first time touching their kid after it comes out of the incubator. This probably fixes that problem on a social level, and then I also get all of the other economic benefits. So what do you think?
I think I unbelievably disagree. Obviously, I'm going to disagree. But on a serious note, even if I was at the con, I would still disagree. I don't think that, one, I don't think you've really attacked the idea of the IQ claim that I've made. Two, I do want to talk about that. Study. So first and foremost, what Stephen Levitt says is in the study, what he says in the book, and what other people extrapolate from it may be different. So Stephen Levitt showed that this was happening. He said it comes from single motherhood. It comes from the problems in the society. However, we can look to other people who have seen this study and very similar studies, and we can derive a different extrapolation, right? So again, let's go back to Jordan Peterson, everybody's favorite layman psychologist, right? So we do know that IQ, 60 to 70% biological, genetic. We do know that those who live in poor conditions tend to have lower IQs, because if they had higher IQs, they would do better. That's one of the foundations of psychometrics is set on, you have a high IQ, you earn a lot in life. That's a simple fact. So we do see that there is that. So we cannot we cannot just look at it from just saying that these single mothers couldn't take care of their kids, because he later has another study that says that there's no socioeconomic, or that the only way to derive how well a child's going to do in their life is their socioeconomic balance. Now, again, that's looking at it from an economist point of view. You add in the psychologist's point of view, you'll have two factors, conscientiousness and IQ. And if you meet neither of those, you're going to be poor, no matter what your original situation was in life, and no matter what your last situation in life, you're going to be poor.
I agree. There are personality traits which make it more or less likely for you to make a lot of money. But what your argument's begging the question is that, well, we should just let those kids die as opposed to being wards of the state, because on net it would increase productivity. I guess the question to ask you then is, if you could test people's IQs while they're in the womb, would you force abortions, or would you kill all dumb people? Because on net it would increase the productivity of the state.
So based on your argumentation strategy, I think that would be a logical conclusion.
Why? Because that's what you're
you're
like.
Okay, so here's why. So this is an unfairness to the child to grow up to be stupid. Therefore, we ought to do something about it. One of the best ways that we can do something about it is to end the child's life. Therefore, the child does not have to grow in the suffering that it has from having a lower IQ.
What's more unfair, dying or perhaps being a little bit poor?
Honestly, I would say being poor, as someone who spent most of his life very poor. At most times of my life, I wanted to kill myself so that I stopped being poor.
All right. I think perhaps you're a deviant from the norm. I'm also from a low socioeconomic environment. If everyone who is poor would prefer to die, they would probably kill themselves, but they don't. Like some do, sure. But there's a revealed preference for continuing life. It also implies that that these kids would also prefer not to live, and that's assuming that they have these genetic predispositions. Like just because your parents have that predisposition doesn't mean that you will. So you're blanketing like of those 68 million kids or however many was in the study would not happen. But I think you're debating adjacent the topic. The topic is about the harm that would accrue to women that I just simply avoid.
Right. But by simply avoiding it, you still don't get. Sorry, my daughter's over here writing on my notes. I'm writing. She's like all over everything I just wrote, by the way. So, anyway, back to what I was going off. Wow. Thanks, Josie. So, again, let's talk about the mother cannot take care of the child, does not fix the problem, right? And it does not fix the problem because back to that statement that I made about children going into being the wards of the state and stuff like that. And you said that the more this happens, the more pressure there will be on the state. And secondly, that you don't agree that this will happen. And again, you used the case study of Australia. I used the case study of the United States. And we do see in the United States that this happens. So what I would say is I don't think that a pressure on the state would actually make a change about this because, again, in the United States, we actually have a severe problem with child protective services and children and foster homes. I think it's right off the top of my head, 3 million children. Let me check.
While you're looking that up, remember earlier in the debate where you're like, this is probably really far in the future. We can assume other medical technologies. I can also assume better policies. You know what I mean? Like, this is you're not looking at the problem that this creates. Because as I said before, there are very, very few abortions, which means there's very, very few kids entering this circumstance, which means that actually the big thing is the number of women who get pregnant, which is almost all of them, because almost all women have kids. This just removes the harm to this massive number of people in society, which means that they can continue their careers.
Right. No, I get that. And I didn't know how well we were going to jump through the technological hoop, but I guess if we're going to jump through the technological hoop again, I'll go back to my Aldous Huxley dystopian future. And even if you don't buy that, we can have the Tyler Cowen dystopian future where you'll have the very rich and the very poor. So I really didn't want to bring that up because that just gets ridiculous and muddies the water. But what I do want to say is, through everything, overall, I think it's easier for people to buy my argument of love and utility than it is for people to just give up on a natural action. So at the end of the day, if we're trying to convince the world what should happen, who would you look at and think that makes the most sense? Are you going to look at the harms and the dangers of a small minority of amount of people? Because the amount of women that die in pregnancy is not very big. And we can already explain away the inequality between male and female, mostly through IQ. And then we can look at the inequality of force and coercion. You say force, I don't necessarily buy that. I should have probably brought that up earlier, but I don't necessarily buy it. But at the end of the day, you as the watcher, would you ban pregnancy for this small amount of stuff?
I mean,
or would you look to?
All right. Well, it's pretty big though. Like there are lots of people, like lots. You know, like every woman who wants to have a kid now just doesn't have to tank their career. Feels good to me, you know.
My wife never tanked her career. She stayed working at her job until she was 8.5 months pregnant, and she was a setup technician, so she was moving and running around and stuff like that. And so she was 8.5 months pregnant, and then she had the child, and then she went back to work in 6 weeks. And
well, then she's very
never lost.
Most women become stay-at-home wives because they can't get a job after 5 years of being out of the workforce to take care of the kid. This just fixes it, you know. But in any case, I really enjoyed this debate for no prep time whatsoever. Really fun cracker. Sorry, did you have a final?
What did you call me?
I said it was a cracky debate, mate. You just can't hear me because my teeth as an alligator just lend me to like mispronounce words. Yeah,
Chompy and aggressive.
feels bad, man. All right, good
All
debate.
right, thank you, man. Have a good
You
one.
too.